I started the recording. Okay, today we're going to stop a few minutes early, about 12 o'clock, so that those of you here can stand back and you can look over that for about the last 15 minutes. Then those of you who are Zooming, when you're here, stop early so you can look at your exam. There are three questions that a good many people miss that I think are really important. I haven't made the video over those yet, but in the next few days I will do that, and I'll put that up because I think they're really useful questions to focus on, because you see there the potential for making mistakes. So I will have those up in the next few days. Also, over the weekend, I was able to look at your course and look at the questions that people missed. And I have decided that you can add 4 points to the grade that you see on Moodle. So whatever it is, I may not change the grade on Moodle, but when I do your calculation, it will include 4 extra points. Any questions on that? Okay. Well, keep it on. Okay. Keep in mind that we started into macroeconomics last time with chapter 27, and now we're going back to chapter 26. Macroeconomics doesn't focus in on individual markets or individual prices. Macroeconomics looks at the big picture, and we try to think about what are the things that cause unemployment? What are the things that cause national output to go up and to go down? What are the things that cause inflation? Remember, with back in chapter 3 and chapter 4, we developed supply and demand, which we said we could use to think about what causes the price of a particular product, say the price of gas, or the price of mask, to go up or to go down. But with inflation, we're asking, well, what is the cause of a situation where all the prices are going up? It's not just 1 or 2, it's pretty much everything is going up. What causes that? Well, that's a macroeconomic question. And we're going to be developing a model that will help us to answer all of these questions about unemployment, about national output, about inflation. And that model will be called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. It'll be similar to supply and demand, but there will be some significant differences. We don't actually get into that model until we get over to chapter 32. Okay? So from this point on, we're going to be getting ready to look into that model. And in this chapter, we're primarily focused on GDP. GDP is our main measure of how much the economy is producing. And so we need to know, well, exactly what is it representing? How is it calculated? And we're going to begin. We will have a definition for GDP in just a moment. But first, I want to give you kind of the big picture for macroeconomics. There are 3 main issues or 3 main problems that we are interested in macroeconomics. You could say there are 3 objectives that we would like to achieve. 1, we would like to achieve economic growth. And we've talked about growth before, especially in chapter 27. Economic growth just means that the economy is growing. GDP is increasing from one year to the next. In terms of, if you go back to, chapter 2, you may recall we had developed the idea of a production possibilities frontier. Okay? And that frontier was a graph that showed us how much the country could produce of different things. And it was very simplified. I think some of the examples, we had an economy that could produce shirts or they could produce computers. And we were using that to represent the whole economy. Well, when we talk about economic growth, we're really saying we want that production frontier to be shifting out. Because if it's shifting out, shifting to the right and up, that means that our ability to produce is growing. So this first goal of economic growth really means we want the production frontier to be shifting out. Second goal of macroeconomic policy, you might say, is full employment. Okay? At each point in time, we would like to be fully utilizing our resources. If you go back to the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there were significant periods when unemployment exceeded 25%, which meant for every 4 people who were willing and able to work, one of those people was not able to find a job. They were not producing anything. Well, clearly, if 1 out of 4 people aren't producing anything, you're not going to be producing as much as you're capable of producing. So when we say we would like to be at full employment, we mean that we would like to be, at each point in time, we would like to be utilizing our resources fully. Another way to say that would be, we'd like to be on the frontier all the time. Okay? If we have 25% unemployment, clearly we're not producing as much as we're capable of producing. So we're going to be inside the frontier. If we had full employment of our resources, how much unemployment would you think we would have? You would think, well, if we have full employment, that sounds like 100% employment, so that would imply 0 unemployment. Turns out that's not exactly the way it is, because in a dynamic economy where things are changing all the time, okay, and we definitely have a dynamic economy, every week consumers are changing what they want to buy. They decide, I'm not going to buy that product anymore. I'm going to buy this other product. Okay? And when consumers change what they want to buy, that means producers have to change what they're producing. And that means that some people are going to get laid off, and then workers are going to be hired in other industries. So it's not surprising that we are always going to have some unemployment. We would like to have 0, but that's just not realistically possible. So when we say we would like to have full employment of our resources, we'll see that really means we would like to get the unemployment rate as low as we can get it without running into problems. Okay? And how low is that? Well, when we get over to chapter 30, we will come back to that question. But for right now, we can just say to be at full employment means we want the unemployment rate to be as low as we can get it without that causing problems. Anybody know what the unemployment rate was back in February before things changed?
Was it 8%?
Nope. It was about 8%, I believe, the following month. But before things changed, the unemployment rate was at 3.5%. And that is pretty much considered full employment, because we generally can't get it much below that. Okay? Then when the pandemic hit and the shutdown was instituted, then we had a huge increase. And I believe in the first month, I think it went up to 7.9, and then it went up to almost 15%, okay? Which is significantly lower than what a lot of people were expecting. Okay? When we get to chapter 30, we'll talk about exactly what the unemployment rate is and how it's measured. And we'll see that in reality, there isn't just one unemployment rate. There are 6 or 7 different unemployment rates. And if you look at all of them, you can get a better idea of what's actually happening in the economy. But we'll come back to that in chapter 30. The third macroeconomic goal for that we have for the economy is price level stability. Okay? We don't want to have the situation they have in Venezuela now, where prices every few days prices are doubling. Okay? The inflation rate is in the thousands of percent each year. Okay? We don't want that. Okay? We would like price level stability. We know that every year some prices are going to go up. Some prices are going to go down. Think about what we said in chapter 3 and 4. We said that prices communicate information, and as things change, supply and demand change, and the price will change. And it's not bad for prices to change. It's really important that the government allow prices to go to their equilibrium levels, because if they don't, we'll have shortages. But what we mean when we say price level stability, we mean we want prices in general to be stable. We know some are going to go up, some are going to go down, but we would like it if the price level, the average of prices in the economy, stays constant over time. Now, if the price level were constant, if it weren't changing from one year to the next, what would the inflation rate be? What is the inflation rate? Inflation rate is the annual rate at which the price level is changing. So if the price level was remaining constant, what would the inflation rate be?
0.
It would be 0. Okay? So there's a sense in which we would like to have 0 inflation. Okay? But a few years back, the Federal Reserve, it's really their primary job to keep inflation down. The Fed said, you know, if we shoot for 0 inflation, it's possible that we may miss it and we may actually have negative inflation, which is called deflation. And deflation, falling prices, that sounds good. You know, it sounds like it'd be great to go to the store every week and things are cheaper than the week before. But if you look back historically, periods of deflation tend to also be periods of depression. Okay? And we don't want depression. So this is a little tricky to say. Our goal is price level stability, but the Fed doesn't actually shoot for 0 inflation. They've set their goal for 2% inflation. Okay? But that's fairly close to 0, but it's enough above 0 so the Fed is comfortable. If we shoot for 2%, then the inflation rate's not going to go negative. Okay? It's kind of a complicated idea, and right now it's very important because the Fed has just in the last 2 weeks changed what their plans are concerning inflation. And they're still shooting for 2% inflation on average, but how they go about achieving that, they've changed in an important way, which we won't talk about that here, but we will talk about that later. Okay? So those are the 3 main macroeconomic issues that we're going to be interested in, or problems we're going to be interested in. And most of this chapter is going to be about one thing: gross domestic product, GDP. What is it? How is it calculated? Because we can't really use it if we don't know what it is. Okay? And there's an incredible amount of detail that comes with GDP. I remember very vividly when I took my first economics course, and I remember thinking, and when we were studying GDP, And I remember thinking, if anybody ever tells me that they fully understand this, I will know that they are lying, because this is just too complicated to fully understand. And so if you feel confused in this chapter, don't be surprised. There are a lot of new terms you're going to be learning in this chapter, but the basics aren't that hard, and you definitely don't have to understand everything. You do need to understand the basics. So remember, we said the goal for GDP is we're trying to measure, how's the economy doing? How much are we producing? Think about how difficult a question that is to answer, because do we just produce one thing or two things or 100 things? The US economy produces literally millions of different products. Cars and flowers and sugar, all these different things. How do you add cars and flowers and sugar together and get a meaningful number? It's not obvious how you do that. So GDP, our definition of GDP, is going to give us direction as to how we go about coming up with this single measure that represents how the economy is doing. And here's the, let's see here. Before I give you a definition, I would show you this. This was an article I saw over the summer, just to get you thinking about how important this is. U.S. economy contracted at record rate last quarter. That was the second quarter of the year. Jobless claims went up to 1.43 million. Okay. That was for 1 week. And then down here in red, GDP fell at a 32.9% annual rate in the second quarter. Okay. 33%, basically 1/3 of the output disappeared. Okay. That's what that sounds like. So from that, I want you to see that what we are experiencing in 2020 in terms of the economy is totally unprecedented. Okay. The Great Depression lasted a lot longer. Okay. That was the really difficult thing about the Depression. It started roughly in the early 30s and pretty much continued until in the 40s. But you didn't have the incredible drop that we've had over the last few months. Okay? So things have changed a lot, and that should pique your curiosity as to what are the implications of this? How is this going to work out? What can the government do potentially to make it better? Other thing I want you to see here, notice it says fell at a 32.9% annual rate in the second quarter, or a 9.5% drop compared with the same quarter a year ago. So in that one sentence, they're giving you two different numbers that describe what happened. And it's probably not obvious to you what the difference is between those. In fact, I know of an economist who I have a great respect for, but he was in a debate and he got confused as to exactly what those numbers mean. So it is complicated. One of the things I want you to see here is that if somebody is looking at this report and they want to convince you things are really, really bad, which number are they going to emphasize? The 32.9% annual drop. If they want to make it sound like, well, it's not that bad, then they're going to use the other number. And neither one of them would be lying, because these are both true, but they're different ways of expressing what has happened. 32.9 annual rate is saying If what happened in the second quarter continues for a whole year, then output will have dropped by 33%. And the other number is saying that output for the second quarter is about 10% lower than it was in the second quarter of the previous year. Okay? Both of those are useful ways to look at it. Okay? But if you don't think carefully, then you can be manipulated, and a person can give you the number that paints the picture they want you to accept. And we're going to see that whether you're talking about output or unemployment or prices, there's always lots of data out there. And somebody who wants to make things look like they're not that bad, they're going to choose certain numbers. And somebody who wants to make it look like things are terrible, they're going to choose different numbers. And if you want to get a reasonable perspective, you have to be aware of that and ask questions. And we'll be seeing, that's one of the purposes of this course, is to make you familiar with different sources of data, so that when you hear one number, you can say, okay, well, unemployment went up, but what about this other thing? All right, on to our definition. Gross domestic product, GDP, is the total market value. First, I'll warn you, it's kind of a long definition, but every part of it is important. Okay? It's the total market value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's borders. Okay? Notice first, it's the total market value. We measure value not by how much does the product weigh, not by what does the government think this product is worth. Okay? We measure value by market value. We use market prices to determine what something is worth. So if a new painting is done and it sells for $100,000, okay, what does that add to GDP? $100,000. If it was produced this year and if somebody paid that much for it, then the government says that's what it's worth. The government does not bring in an appraiser and say, oh, that's not really worth that much. What if somebody's willing to pay that much for it? That's what it's worth. So, a hamburger, what does it add to GDP? Well, what are people willing to pay for it? What is the market price? We use market prices to represent value. We don't have the government inserting their own judgments. Okay? What is a pack of or a carton of cigarettes worth? Okay? For some people, it's worth a lot. Other people would say, oh, that will cause you to have cancer. That has no value. Okay? What's it worth in terms of GDP? Okay? Whatever the market price is. Okay? That's the judgment that is being made. So GDP represents the total market value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's borders. Notice we are including goods, things that are produced, but also services. If you go to a concert and you pay $100 for the ticket, okay, well, when you leave the concert, do you have something physical? You can say, see, here's my concert. No, you had an experience and you paid something to have that experience. What's it worth in terms of GDP? Whatever you were willing to pay for. That is the assumption that is being made. Okay? We are including only final goods and services. In a minute, we'll make a distinction between final goods and intermediate goods, but we're only going to be including final goods. Notice we're calculating the value of all final goods and services produced annually. We're not trying to measure the value of everything that we have. We're trying to measure the value of what was produced during a 12-month period. Okay? Okay? So it's not what we have, it is what was produced. And notice, it's what we produce over a period of time, and we do calculate it annually. Okay? The government, they actually report the GDP numbers every quarter. So every 3 months, they will come out with, here's what GDP was for the last quarter. Okay? But that's kind of a intermediate number, because ultimately we look at what was GDP for the whole year. Okay? And notice the last part, within a country's borders. Okay? With GDP, we don't care who produced it. We care where was it produced. If you have something that, a hamburger, okay, that was produced and sold at a McDonald's in Alexandria, okay? If it was produced by somebody who's a citizen of the United States, we're going to include it because it was produced here. If it was produced by somebody who is a student and who's a citizen of another country, are we going to include it? Absolutely, because with GDP, we don't care who produced it. If it was produced here, we want to include it. Okay? Citizenship is irrelevant. Another number we're interested in, GDP per capita. That was introduced in chapter 27. All it means is GDP divided by the population. So GDP is the total value of what was produced in the whole country. Per capita GDP would be how much was produced on average by a person in that country. Okay. Okay. Intermediate goods and finished or final goods. I'll give you the definitions here. That'll probably be a little confusing, but I think the examples will clarify. Intermediate goods are goods sold to firms and then bundled or processed with other goods or services for sale at a later stage. Okay? What's important there is if something is an intermediate good, it's going to be sold again. Okay? It's going to be sold again. It has not yet reached the hands of the final consumer. Whereas finished goods or final goods and services are sold or have been sold to the final users and then consumed or held in personal inventories. Okay? We are only going to be counting final goods. We are not going to be including intermediate goods. Why do we make that distinction? Well, if we included intermediate goods and finished goods, final goods, we would be double counting. We would be counting some things more than once. So here, which of the following is a finished good? A book in Amazon's inventory. So Amazon has already bought it. Tires purchased by a Toyota plant, or tires purchased by you for your car. What about the book in Amazon's inventory? That's what? It's going to be an intermediate good because Amazon did not buy that book because Jeff Bezos wanted to read it. Okay? They bought it because they're holding it in inventory. They're going to sell it to somebody else. Okay? So it is going to be sold again. It's not a final good. We're not going to include it. Tires purchased by a Toyota plant. Is that intermediate or final? It's intermediate. Why does Toyota buy the tires? They're gonna be sold again. They're gonna take those tires, they're gonna put them on a new vehicle, and then they're going to sell that new vehicle with the tires. So if we included the tires Toyota buys, and we include the car that you buy, let's say from Toyota, okay, we would be double counting the value of the tires, because the price you pay for the car is you're paying for the value of the car, and that includes the value of the tires. So the tires will be included in the value of the final product that is produced. Okay? And then that's where we get to the last one. Tires purchased by you for your car. Okay? If you go to the store and you buy tires, what are you going to do with them? You're going to put them on your car. You're going to use those tires. You're not going to sell them to somebody else. So you are the final consumer. So when you buy tires and you buy something to be used by yourself or your family, that is a final good that will be included in GDP. When the manufacturer purchases something which they're going to use and then resell the product, that's an intermediate good. We do not include that. We'll have a couple of other examples in a moment. Gross national product. Okay. Now, it sounds a whole lot gross domestic product. They're very, very similar. We're not going to say much about it, except one thing you need to remember. Look at the definition here. How does it differ from the definition for GDP? It's the market value of all finished goods and services produced by a country's citizens wherever located within a year. What's the difference?
Where they're located at.
Well, with what?
Like they could be outside the border.
That's right. With gross national product, GNP, we're calculating the value of what was produced by the citizens of a country. Some of them would have been for the US, some of them would have been producing things in this country. Some of them would be producing things in other countries. Okay? For GNP, we are including the value of what was produced by all the citizens of a country. For example, I have a friend who for years was an engineer for Chevron, and he worked in Kazakhstan. He continued to be a citizen of the United States, but he was producing in another country. So the value of what he produced, would that be included in US GDP? No, because he didn't produce it here. Would it be included in US GNP? Yes, it would, because he was a citizen, and GNP calculates the value of what was produced by the citizens in a country. Okay? If you had taken this class 20 years ago, roughly 10, maybe 25, you would not have heard anything about GDP. Everything was about GNP. But then at some point, I'm not sure who made the decision, but it was decided to put the emphasis on GDP because that's what most other countries focus on. And so we want to be able to compare our data with their data. So now you don't hear much about GNP. Everything's about GDP. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference which one we look at. All I want you to recognize is that one is focused on the value of what was produced within the country's borders by everybody who was within the borders, and the other, GNP, is focusing on citizenship. If every American citizen lived within the national borders, and if nobody lived here or worked here who was not a citizen, how would GNP and GDP compare?
It'd be the same.
They would be exactly the same. Okay? They diverge only when you have somebody who's a citizen in one country earning income in another country. Okay? And that's really all we'll say about that. National wealth. Okay? This is just something to point out. National wealth refers to the value of a nation's entire stock of assets. So if we were going to talk about the wealth of the U.S., we would have to try to calculate the value of everything that was owned by American citizens. Okay? So there, notice with wealth, there's no time dimension. Okay? You don't say my wealth is, so many dollars per hour. Okay? Your wealth is the value of what you own at a point in time. GDP always has a time dimension, okay? Just like your income has a time dimension. You wouldn't say my income is $15. No, you'd say my income is $15 per hour, or so much per month, or so much per year. Okay? We're not going to be focusing on wealth. We're going to be focusing on the value of what was produced during a particular time period. And you might think, well, why do we care? Well, we care because when we change policies, especially when government changes policies, we're interested in what effect does that have? When a policy is changed, does that have a positive effect or a negative effect? And if we look at GDP and how it changes over time, and then we try to determine, well, why did that happen? Then hopefully we can learn, oh, if we have this kind of policy, that leads to growth. That's a good thing. If we have this other kind of policy, then that leads to deterioration and a lower standard of living. If we don't know what's happening to GDP, then when we change policy, how do we know if it had a positive effect or a negative effect? So having GDP is a way that we can assess how the economy is doing in a particular year, and then we can compare that to how we did in a previous year. It is calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the Department of Commerce. I'm not going to ask you a question about that, but that is where it's calculated. Here is a simple example of how GDP would be calculated for a very, very small and simple economy. Let's say that, and this is from your book, let's say there are only 2 finished goods that are produced in the economy. You got cars, you got chickens. Okay? Well, you can't add cars and chickens directly. You add the weight, well, the cars weigh a whole lot more than the chickens. So that really wouldn't give you useful information. So how do you add cars and chickens? Well, you calculate the market value. And to find market value, you just take, well, what is one car worth? What is the quantity of cars we produced? Multiply those together, and that gives you the market value of that product. So the average price of cars, according to this data, was $28,000. And just pause for a second. You see the complexity that we get into when we try to calculate GDP. Because do all cars sell for $28,000? No, there's a huge range. So, just figuring out what that average is, that would be difficult. And you have to have somebody in government who's dealing with that complexity. All we're doing here is trying to illustrate what we're trying to do. Okay? We look at the different products that are being produced. What was the average price per car? How many cars were produced? Price times quantity gives us the total market value of all of those cars. Obviously, cars worth one car is worth a whole lot more than one chicken, okay? But we produced a whole lot more chickens than we did cars. So if we're going to have a reasonable estimate of the value of what we produce, we've got to take into account how many we produced of each thing and what the price of each one was. So we see that the cars had a market value of 336 billion, chickens market value of 43 billion. Add those together, you get $379 billion. So if you had a country where these 2 things were the only things they produced, then we could say their GDP was $379 billion. So the basic idea is pretty straightforward. you identify what are the things we produced, what were the prices, what were the quantities, you do a multiplication, you add them up, that's GDP. Okay? So any question about that basic idea? It's not very complicated. The reason GDP does become complicated is because we don't produce two goods, we produce millions of different goods. So imagine a table here where you've got millions of rows. Just the arithmetic would become very complicated. And then also you have to have somebody collect all this data. They had to figure out what's the average price for each thing, what quantity sold. There's an enormous amount of complexity that the government has to deal with. Thankfully, we don't have to deal with that complexity. You need to understand the basic ideas that we have shown here. All right, there are certain transactions or certain types of transactions that are not included when calculating GDP. So I want to emphasize those. One, the sale of used goods. Okay. Back in February, before the hurricane hit, before the giant tree fell on my minivan, my insurance company tells me that my minivan had a market value of about $5,700. Okay? So if I had known that that we're going to have the hurricane, I might have sold my minivan. It was built and I bought it in 2008. Okay? Well, if I had sold my minivan in 2020 for $5,700, would that add to GDP in 2020? No, why not? I mean, it's a valuable vehicle, is worth $5,700. Why don't we include it?
It's used good. It's already used.
I'm sorry, I'm missing.
It's already used.
It's already been included. It was produced in an earlier year. It was sold in a different year. It was produced in 2008. It was included in GDP in 2008. Notice with GDP, we are always trying to measure the value of what was produced in that year. So when you have the sale of a used car, sale of a used house, we don't usually talk about houses as being used, but if you're buying a house that was built in a previous year, then it is a used house. And we don't include it in GDP. You buy a used textbook, okay? We don't include it in GDP. Why? Because it has already been included in a previous year. So anything that's used, we're not going to include it. We're only measuring the value of what was produced during the year. Okay. Now we'll touch on a little bit of complexity here. If you buy a house that was built at some point in the past and it sold at some point in the past, okay, and you pay, $200,000 for it this year, it's a used house. We do not include the value of that used house in 2020's GDP. Okay? But when you buy it, when somebody sells a house, how do they usually do it? Who do they use to find a buyer for that house? They use a broker. They use a real estate agent. And the real estate agent is not helping them just because they want to help. The real estate agent is going to be compensated. They're going to pay a fee, or they're going to receive a commission when that house sells. The commission the real estate agent receives is compensation for the service they are providing to the seller. And when did they provide that service? This year. Okay? It's a used house. We don't include the $200,000 market value of the house, but we do include the value of any commissions that were received, because those represent the value of services that were produced this year. Same thing with a used car. If you sell it to a used car dealer, there's going to be some kind of commission on that. That commission is going to be included in GDP, but the value, excuse me, the value of the used car is not. It may seem like that there are all these exceptions that just come out of the blue. No, there are a few exceptions that you'll need to be familiar with, and that's one of them. Also, purely financial transactions. Let's say that you decide you inherit $10,000. Go home today, you get a letter, and your rich uncle you never knew about died and left you $10,000. And you decide to take that $10,000 and invest it in stock of some company, say Amazon. You think it's going to do well, so you invest in Amazon. Do we include the $10,000 you're investing in Amazon? No, that is a purely financial transaction. You are giving somebody $10,000, and when you buy stock, what are you getting? I'm sorry. You're getting a share or shares of that company, which means you're getting a percentage of ownership in that company. And the company already existed. When you invest $10,000 in Amazon, that doesn't create new value. It's just that a very small part of Amazon, which belonged to somebody else, is now going to belong to you. You're purchasing something that already existed. And so since there's no production, we don't include the value of that transaction. It's a perfectly good thing to buy stock, but it doesn't add to GDP. On the other hand, when you go to buy that stock, how do you find somebody who's interested in selling it to you? You probably are going to go to a broker, and that broker is going to charge you a commission. They're charging you a fee for the service that they are providing. You've told them, I want to buy some Amazon stock. They go out and find somebody who wants to sell it. So they're providing a valuable service to you, and the commission you pay is the reward they get for providing that service. The commission they get on that transaction would be included, but the amount of the transaction would not be. Pretty much the same principle as with the house. And then lastly, government transfer payments. Okay? When we talk about government transfer payments, here's the definition we're going to give. A payment that is not made in exchange for a good or service currently supplied. Transfer payment is a payment that is not made in exchange for a good or service currently supplied. That sounds complicated, but the idea is pretty simple. We want to include the value of what was produced during the year. So if someone is making a payment in order to get something that was produced during the year, we want to include it. But if the government is making a payment not in exchange for something that has been produced this year, we don't include it. So let me give you a few examples. We're almost out of time. Okay. If the government spends money to build new roads. They're hiring engineers to design the road. They're hiring, they're renting equipment to move the dirt. They're paying workers. Would that spending be transfer payments? And the transfer payments we're not going to include because there's no production. If the government is paying to build new roads, is something being produced? Is the government getting something for their payment? They
Yes.
are. They're getting a new road. When they hire the engineer to design the road, they're getting a plan from that engineer. That's a valuable thing he's providing. So everybody who has paid money to contribute to the production of this road, that will be included. That's not a transfer payment. If the government pays money to repair existing roads, okay? Well, the road's already there, but they are repairing. You got a road that's something's wrong with it. So if somebody is repairing an existing road, then that means they're providing a service. They're making it better. They're providing something. And so the payment to repair the existing road would be included in GDP. It's not a transfer payment. If the government spends money to make Social Security payments to retirees, what about that? That is a transfer payment. Okay? The government is giving money to the retirees. What is the government getting in exchange? Is the government saying, you did a great job being retired, so here's your money for what you produced? No, the government is saying, under the law, you're entitled to this money. Here it is. There's no production there. If there's no production, it's a payment where there's no production, then it is a transfer payment. We do not include it. If the government spends money to purchase new computers for the IRS, should we include that, or is it a transfer payment? We should include it. The government is spending money to get something, to get the new computers. There's production there. And with GDP, we're trying to measure the value of everything that was produced during the year. Government spends money to build new university buildings. Well, if they're building a new building, then they're spending money to get something produced that would be included in GDP, not a transfer payment. Pay for medical services received by retirees, which is Medicare, and low-income families, which is Medicaid. The government is spending to pay for services received by these different groups. Is that a transfer payment? Should we include? It's not a transfer payment, okay, because the government is paying so that these people will get medical services. There is production there. Okay? So the rule is simple. If they're making a payment because something is being produced, then it should be included. It's not a transfer payment. The government spends money to pay unemployment benefits. What about that? Should that be included in GDP?
No.
That's a transfer payment. If the government's giving you $500 a week or a month, they're not saying you did a great job of being unemployed. Yeah, we've been watching you and what you did was worth that much money. No, they're saying under the law, you're entitled to this. Here it is. There's no production there. And so we don't add it into GDP. When we say there's no production, that doesn't mean, we're not saying that it's bad. We're simply saying nothing was produced, and so we should not include it in our measure of production, which is GDP. Government purchases land for a new police station. That would not be included in GDP. Why? They're getting land. Was that land created? That land already existed, so it's just a transfer of ownership of something that already existed. Okay? And then provide food stamps to low-income families. There's no production going on there. Okay? Someone is getting money, but it doesn't mean that food has been created. So those would be transfer payments, and we would not include that in GDP. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop here so I can pass these the exams out. If you're Zooming on Thursday, you'll have the opportunity to look at your exam. So we are done. Okay. These are in alphabetical order. Alvarez. Let's see. Charmaine. Sharon.
Sharon, hey, are we done, right?
Yes, you're done.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're Alex. You don't get to read these, but you can welcome to take notes on what you missed. And if you don't have enough time to look at them today, you can look at them in the office after class. Here, Lacey.